Thanks so much, Jamie. It's really exciting to be here, even virtually, and to be sharing what's actually a new project today. And it's a little bit of a departure from a lot of my past work. So as Jamie mentioned, a lot of my past work has been focused internationally in settings where people have very large family sizes. And I remember the last time I gave a talk at IPR a few years ago, I gave kind of an overview of some of this work on global family change. And in contrast to that really global focus, I'm actually talking about a project that's focused on the US today. And so this is an early stage project. So I'm really excited to hear people's thoughts and feedback in thinking about next steps. So this project really stems from two different sets of empirical observations. So the first empirical observation is the so-called two-child norm in the United States. So this is the idea that having a family size of about 2 children is normatively preferable. And in survey research, we see that reported preferences for family size of about 2 children really gains prominence between the mid-1960s and the early 1970s. And this preference endures sort of through the start of the 21st century. So we have sort of the last big update of this literature in the early 2000s, finding evidence for this continued supporting preference for a family size of about 2 children in the US. So the second entry point of the talk is a sociological literature, and it extends beyond sociology, really, on what's called the stalled gender revolution. So this is the argument that the sweeping changes in the gender system that we've seen since the 1960s have stalled in really important dimensions in recent years. So for example, although women's labor force participation and education have increased dramatically since the 1960s, in more recent years, we've seen that the gender wage gap has remained stagnant. So this is, what we see in this figure up here. And the gender wage gap is just one example of this stall. There are a number of other indicators we could look at. We see endurance and occupational segregation by gender, segregation of fields of study, and so on. And many scholars have argued that there have been even greater stalls in progress towards gender equality in the personal realm compared to the professional realm. So, for example, in heterosexual romantic relationships, the gender division of care within the home continues to be highly unequal. And we can see this in, this very simplistic infographic I have up here on the very different amounts of time that men and women on average spend on care work on a daily basis. We have women spending an average of 2 hours and 15 minutes, and men spending an average of about an hour and a half. And even in homosexual romantic relationships, there's some evidence that one partner often ends up specializing in care work more than the other, and that this, may even have some gendered components. So I know Mignon Moore has a really interesting study of Black lesbian families where she finds that though both spouses express a strong commitment to egalitarianism, biological mothers often end up with a heavier care burden. Of course, in addition to differential care burdens within two-parent families, we know as well that over time, more and more children are growing up in single-parent families, particularly single mother families in the US, where care burden is, of course, quite high for the primary caregiver. So bringing together these two sort of empirical observations, these two different literatures, on both the two-child norm and also the stalled gender revolution, this raised a key question that I was interested in exploring. So in this context of a stalled gender revolution, have we seen a decline in this two-child norm or preference for having 2 children? And does this vary by gender? And I'm taking a cohort perspective to look at this question of whether there's been a decline in the two-child norm. And here I'm particularly interested in understanding whether there's been a decline among millennials compared to those in older cohorts. And I'm doing this cohort perspective because I think there are reasons to believe that millennials would be particularly likely to have declining fertility preferences and in ways that might be disaggregated by gender. So on one hand, millennial men and women are more likely to express gender egalitarian attitudes compared to older cohorts. So as we see in this figure I have on the screen, millennials tend to score higher on indices of egalitarianism compared to older cohorts. And this reflects that they are more likely to believe in equality both at work and at home. And this is a pattern that we see across millennial men and women of different socioeconomic backgrounds and different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So for example, in Pew opinion polling, millennials are more likely than older cohorts to report that both spouses should share the housework and child-rearing in an ideal marriage. And, for example, we have about 72% of millennials reporting this preference for sharing compared to only about 59% of baby boomers. But although millennials are more likely to proclaim these gender egalitarian ideals, they often fall back on traditional gender roles, particularly after having children. So for example, the gender division of labor in the family remains unequal among millennials, even though millennials are more likely than older cohorts to state a preference for sharing. And of course, for single parent families, it might be particularly challenging to navigate competing demands related to work, childcare, and so on. So this means that millennials in particular may struggle to put their egalitarian ideals into practice. And in this respect, millennials really exemplify this tension between these changing norms of egalitarianism and the stalled gender revolution in the family. So it's in this context of egalitarian ideals and unequal care burdens that I am interested in looking at if family size preference declines among millennials. And given women's disproportionate care burden in both single parent and two parent families, I'm particularly interested in looking at if millennials' women's family size preference decline more than that of their male counterpart. Now, before I get into the empirical part of the talk, I want to briefly touch on the question of why family size norms matter for policy. So things like family size preference, our preference for two children, and so on, these are really intimately related to other important social phenomena, to things like low fertility and so on. And there's been a lot of attention to the idea that once family size preferences drop to low levels and low fertility becomes normative, it can be very difficult for fertility to rebound to higher levels. And of course, low fertility has important policy ramifications, as we see in many high-income countries that are concerned with aging populations, low birth rates, diminishing economic opportunities for younger generations, and so on. A second reason that I think thinking about family size norms is important for policy is that family size norms both influence and are influenced by many important social policies. So things like paid family leave, subsidized early childhood care, and so on. So we know that the US scores low in terms of provision of family policy if we compare to other high-income countries. And there is some evidence that policy can shape norms in important ways. So for example, I put up this very simplistic figure about looking at changes in women's labor force participation before and after an introduction of a universal pre-K program in DC. So with this in mind, I want to segue into the empirical part of the talk. So to start, how do we measure something like a two-child norm? So this is something I'll look at in a few ways throughout the talk, but I want to start with a very standard, very straightforward, cut and dry demographic measure of family norms. And this is a measure of ideal family size. And the first thing that I'll do is look at predicted counts of ideal family size by cohort to see whether there's been a decline across cohorts and whether this varies by gender. So here I'm using a measure of average ideal family size. So this is from the General Social Survey, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but the GSS is nationally representative microdata. And here I'm focusing specifically on adults of reproductive age, so in the 18 to 46 range. And we have good representation of respondents from each of the three cohorts of interest. And I'm looking at a measure of an ideal family size that's taken from a GSS question about what do you think is the ideal number of children for a family to have. And what I find is actually contrary to my expectations. So I expected ideal family size to fall among millennials, particularly among women, and this is not the case. So instead, I see a lot of consistency across cohorts at an average ideal family size of about 2.5, and there's even a slight increase among millennials. And there's actually no difference by gender in ideal family size. And I think this is a striking finding that in light of, a lot of the dramatic changes over these three cohorts, so big changes in women's labor force participation in this context of this unequal care burden, both men and women have high ideal family sizes. Now, you might be wondering if this apparent stability in ideal family size between these cohorts just reflects compositional differences between these different cohorts. So we know that millennials are by and large younger at time of survey, and younger people are more likely to have higher ideal family sizes. So to account for this, I run a Poisson regression where I predict ideal family size, controlling for key demographic characteristics, things like age, marital status, race, education, and so on. And I calculate the predicted counts of ideal family size by cohort, again, taking into account these compositional differences. And I find that the results are robust to accounting for these compositional differences between groups. So this suggests that this apparent stability in ideal family size over these three cohorts is not just an artifact of these compositional differences between groups. So of course, within cohorts, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So as a next step, I'm breaking this down further by race and ethnicity. And there are a few things to note here. So first of all, ideal family sizes are high among all of the groups. So between 2.4 or 2.8, well above the 2 mark, which gets referred to by demographers as replacement level fertility, by and large across all the groups. That being said, ideals are consistently significantly higher among Black and Hispanic respondents compared to white respondents. And this is true across all three cohorts. Interestingly, though, within racial and ethnic subgroups, there are not significant differences by gender. So there's no indication of declines in ideal family size across cohorts within any of these subgroups. Now, people's ideals about what's best in society might be quite distinct from their own plans, expectations, and intentions, right? So what I do next is look at a second measure that gets at these intentions to understand how distinct ideals are from intentions, and also look at how this changes over cohorts. So here I'm using nationally representative microdata from the National Survey of Family Growth. I'm focusing on survey waves from a similar time frame to the GSS survey waves I use, so from the early 80s onwards, and also looking at adults of reproductive age. And I'm using here a measure of intended family size that's created out of information about current children, pregnancy, and intended births in the future. So what I find is that intended family size is somewhat lower than ideal family size. So it's closer to 2, whereas ideal family size on average was closer to 2.5, but it's still fairly high, still above this, this replacement level, right? And it's quite consistent across cohorts. And once again, there are really no gender differences in family size intentions. And when I break intentions down by race and ethnicity, results largely parallel with what we saw in the ideal family size measure. So by and large, intentions are slightly higher for Black and Hispanic respondents compared to white respondents. And among Hispanic and white respondents, there are no gender differences within racial and ethnic categories. Among Black respondents, women have on average lower intended family sizes than men, and these differences are statistically significant among Gen X and millennials. But once again, there's no evidence of decline in family size attention across cohorts for within any of these subgroups. So what I've shown up to this point signals in many ways an enduring stability of a 2-child norm, or a preference for 2 children among millennials compared to older cohorts, even in light of a lot of the social and economic changes I described at the beginning of the talk. And I see that this continuity in ideal and intended family size is not driven by cohort differences in key demographic characteristics, and there appears to be limited difference by gender. But I want to dig a bit deeper here and raise the possibility that it could be that a preference for 2 children means something very different among millennials than it does among those in earlier cohorts, and that this might vary by gender. So what I'm doing here is situating family size preferences as part of a broader system of family ideologies that encompasses changing gender norms, religiosity, and attitudes about families. And this is particularly relevant in light of the ideational changes that I described before related to changing gender and family dynamics. So in the next part of the talk, I'm taking a more expansive view of thinking about how to measure something like a family norm, such as the 2-child norms. So while demographers are interested in family size preferences and the type of ideal or intended family size question that I just showed you, they often pay less attention to how family size preferences are bundled with wider aspects of family ideology. And gender scholars have focused a lot on attitudes about gender equality in both the public and private spheres. But what I'm arguing here is that it's important to bridge these 2 perspectives together when measuring norms about family size preference, and really think about the areas where they intersect when trying to understand what a preference for 2 children means today. So I use a latent class approach to explore whether there are multiple typologies of 2-child norms and whether these have changed over cohorts. So latent class identifies qualitatively different, unobserved, or latent categories of respondents based on their observed respondent characteristics. It's similar in many ways to clustering approaches that people are familiar, but it does have some important differences. And I'm using the GSS data again. So I'm focusing on data from the mid-1980s onward. And I'm focusing on this time frame because it allows me to take advantage of the fact that a consistent suite of questions on gender and family have been asked since the 1980s. It gives me a good size of respondents from each of these 3 categories of interest. So what I'm doing in this analysis is that I'm hypothesizing that there are different latent constructs of two-child norms that are comprised of observed measures of ideal family size and also norms related to gender, family, religiosity, and so on. So these are the measures that I'm looking at in the latent class analysis. So they're all binary indicators except the ideal family size measure, which is continuous. And all of these binary measures, everything other than the ideal family size, are coded so that a response of 1 reflects the more traditional view, and a response of 0 reflects the less traditional view. So these first 4 measures are commonly used by gender scholars to assess views on gender equality in the private and public sphere. The first 3 relate to the private sphere and capture attitudes on working motherhood and gendered social roles. The 4th captures views about the suitability for women in public office, which scholars have argued is deeply linked to essentialized views on sort of the acceptability of women in the workforce more broadly. The 5th measure relates to beliefs about the decoupling of sex and marriage, which is linked to attitudes towards the sexual revolution and deinstitutionalization of marriage. The 6th measure provides insight into the respondents' level of religiosity, which is an important component of family ideology in the US context. And the 7th measure assesses respondents' views on abortion, which has been intimately connected to American understandings of motherhood and family. And I will note that unfortunately, I'm not including questions here about sexuality, sexual identity, or gender identity because they only get asked more recently. So for comparative focuses, I'm using these questions that have been asked from the mid-80s onwards. Now, to provide some context, these are 4 of the measures that I'm looking at. And as we can see over time, there's been quite a bit of change in these measures. So for example, whereas only about 30% of respondents disagreed with the idea that a preschool child is likely to suffer if their mother works in the mid-1970s, by 2016, close to 70% of respondents agreed with this statement. And we see, by and large, dramatic change across all 4 measures. Now, to return to the latent class analysis, the first step of a latent class analysis is to select the number of classes. And I do this based on model fit statistics. For the sake of time, I'm not going to show that step here, but what I find is that a 4-class model is really best. And next, I give each class a name, which I'll explain in a minute. And what this figure shows is the percentage of respondents in each of the 4 classes, and also the average ideal family size for each class. And in essence, what this is showing is that there are 3 different classes of people with a preference for an average of about 2.5 children. And these 3 classes comprise about 95% of the sample. So there is one small class that comprises about 5% of the sample that has preference for much higher ideal family sizes, but this represents a fairly small percentage of respondents. So these are the 4 classes, and I will walk through this figure. But what is going on here is that each of the letter on the x-axis represents one of the indicators in question. And what this shows is the marginal probability of responding positively to that binary indicator for respondents in a given class. So for example, the C indicator corresponds with the marginal probability of agreeing that the male breadwinner model is preferable. And as we can see, there's quite a bit of variation across these 4 classes in the C indicator, in the probability of agreeing with this statement. So I want to go into more detail about each of these classes, and I'm starting with what I call the 2-child progressive secular class. So this represents about 41% of the sample, And this class of respondent prefers an average of 2.3 children. And these low values on the A-B indicators mean that respondents in this category reject the idea that work and family are incompatible for women. Low values on the C indicator, meanwhile, means that respondents in this category reject the male breadwinner ideal. They also reject the idea that women are less well suited for public office than men. That's the D indicator. The low values on the E indicator reflect rejecting the idea of premarital sex being wrong. And the lower values on the F indicator, particularly relative to the other groups, represents lower levels of religiosity. And finally, they're more likely to reject bans on abortion. The second group of respondents I call two-child progressive religious, and this represents about 30% of the sample. So like the progressive secular group, this category of respondents also expresses a preference for an average of about 2.5 children. Like their secular counterpoints, they tend to be quite progressive on ideas about women's role in work, in family, and in the public sphere, so these A through D indicators, but they exhibit much higher levels of religiosity relative to the progressive seculars, and this is accompanied by beliefs that premarital sex is unacceptable and abortion should be banned. The third group, which I'm calling the two-child traditional group, this represents about 24% of the sample. And like both of the progressive categories, this group expresses a preference of about 2.43 children. But this group ends up looking really different on work, gender, and family views. So we have high values on these A-B indicators reflect agreement that work and family are not compatible for women. High values on the C indicator reflects preference for this male breadwinner, female homemaker model. Higher values on this D indicator compared to the other categories indicates more support for this idea that men are better suited for public office. We see overall, consistent with the progressive religious groups, there's also higher religiosity, more support on banning abortion, and more support for the idea of premarital sex being not appropriate. And finally, the fourth group is what I'm calling the four-child traditional group. They look quite similar to this two-child traditional group, but in general, they express preference for higher ideal family size. And this is a small group of respondents. This group is only about 5% of respondents. So the final step that I do here is explore the demographic characteristics that predict class membership. And I do this using multinomial logistic regression. And what I'm showing here are the predicted probabilities of class membership following multinomial logit. And I'm doing this because I want to know if the predicted probability of class membership is different for millennials compared to older cohorts. And for simplicity here, I'm just comparing millennials to baby boomers. Gen X ends up, basically falling in between. And so I'll highlight a few key trends here. So first of all, I find that millennials are associated with a 12 percentage point higher predicted probability of being in this two-child progressive secular group compared to baby boomers. And this means that millennials are on average embracing a preference for two children that's more progressive than their baby boomer counterpoints, right? Here I'm breaking down these predicted probability of being in these different groups by gender. And to start, I'm focusing on the predicted probability of being in the progressive secular group for men and for women in each of the cohorts. And we can see here that although the predicted probability of being in the progressive secular category increases for both men and women between baby boomers and millennials, there's actually no significant difference in the probability of being in this progressive secular category by gender among either millennials or baby boomers. So this means that men and women are equally likely to be in this category in both time periods. Turning to this two-child progressive religious group, I actually see no significant change in group membership over time. On the other hand, when I break this down by gender, what I see is that women are significantly more likely to be in this progressive religious category than men in both time periods. Turning to this two-child traditional group, I find that millennials are associated with an 11 percentage point lower predicted probability of being in this two-child traditional group compared to baby boomers. So this means that millennials are on average embracing this preference for two children that's less traditional compared to baby boomers. And although membership in this category declines for both men and women, when we compare baby boomers to millennials, men are significantly more likely to be in this traditional category than women in both time periods. And finally, we have this four-child traditional group. So this is sort of this small group, only 5% of the sample, but with these very high family size ideals. And I actually see there's no significant difference in membership in this group over cohorts, and actually no significant difference by gender as well. Okay, so I started this talk by showing continuity in preference for having an average of about 2 children among millennial men and women compared to older cohorts. And I argued that this was a surprising finding. So even in light of the stalled gender revolution, we see family size preferences are high among both men and women. However, aggregate change in preference for 2 children overlooks important complexity in how this norm has changed over time. So even if the preferred number of children is not changing over cohorts, visions of what the family looks like are changing, so that a family size preference of 2 for millennials does not on average mean the same thing as for older cohorts. And as I showed in the latent class analysis, millennials' preference for 2 children are more likely to be characterized by egalitarian views on the gender division of labor and care. And this stands in contrast to older cohorts who are more likely than millennials to have a preference for 2 children that's characterized by more traditional ideas about the gender division of labor and care. And although I see evidence of changing gender norms between generations, I see less evidence of changes within generations, particularly when we're talking about gender-based changes, right? So for example, the gender gap in traditionalism is maintained over cohorts, even though absolute levels of traditionalism have declined. So I've talked quite a bit about fertility preferences, but I haven't mentioned fertility levels very much. And I think everything I presented really raises a key question. So do changes in the 2-child norm that I've documented matter for eventual childbearing? And in speculating on this, I think the literature on gender inequality and low fertility is quite useful. So Peter McDonald and others have made the argument that increasing gender equity in individual-oriented institutions, so things like education and the labor market and so on, combined with enduring gender inequalities in family-oriented institutions, will correspond with low fertility. So in other words, this is the argument that if women's expanded opportunities in education and the labor market do not correspond with an expansion of support for care within the family, this will correspond with reductions in fertility. And this argument about gender inequality and fertility could help explain what we see over the last 2 decades, where we see this steady decline in the total fertility rate. So this is the average number of children per childbearing person. So I would argue that a serious consideration of the role of family size preferences and family ideologies is essential to understanding the dynamics between gender inequality and fertility, and that there's a need for more demographic literature that integrates standard measures of ideal family size with broader conceptions of family ideologies. I think there's also a need for more integration of fertility preferences into a lot of our understandings of attitudinal changes in gender equality. So better really understanding the family ideologies that underlay people's fertility decision-making can be important for understanding why reductions in fertility occur and can also have important implications for policy. So as I suggested at the start of the talk, in light of high women's labor force participation and an unequal care burden, we might expect that family size preferences should decline. And in the absence of change in ideal family size, we might expect alternatively that visions about who does the childcare in the family might change to be less egalitarian. And to the contrary, I find evidence that young people's ideals about family size are remarkably resilient, and that younger cohorts' family size ideals are more gender egalitarian than past cohorts, even while birth rates have declined. So I think this suggests that if there are policies in place that better support the sharing of care work or provide assistance to both single and dual parent families, young people might be able to better implement their family ideals. And of course, there are a range of policy implications that might be important here. So things like expansion to access of early childhood care, paid family leave that corresponds with job protections, and also use it or leave it policies for fathers to incentivize fathers to actually take up family leave. And of course, flexible work and regulation of work hours is another major arena for policy implications. So I'll wrap up in a minute, but I want to briefly touch on a few next steps because as I mentioned, this is very much work in progress, and there are a few different directions I'm planning on heading. So the next thing I'm doing is integrating a longitudinal perspective. So I've taken a cohort perspective here, but within individuals, I'm just looking at sort of a cross-sectional snapshot. So a next step is taking advantage of the panel component of the general social survey and also some ideological and attitudinal components of the NLSY to look at how things like age, transition to parenthood, or economic shocks impact these different categories of two-child norms. So do people sort of change category or typology as they age? And I'm also thinking a bit more about if different typologies of two-child norms correspond with differences in trade-offs. So we could think when faced with constraints, either economic constraints, financial constraints, time constraints, so on, do people in this two-child progressive category, do they make different trade-offs as far as, women's labor force participation, as far as, preference for ideal family size, as far as ideology, as far with respect to sharing of housework and so on. And finally, I have some work that uses panel data to look at how COVID-19 impacted family ideals and family norms. So I see that as kind of another aspect of this bigger picture project.